I am going to tell you a story about Emmy and the incredible shrinking rat. This is just only a podcast, so I hope everyone um, will going to like this video. This is good for our kids because if they keep uh, reading, even the slimy ones, and she never talked back to her nanny, Miss Barmy, although it was almost impossible to keep quiet some days. Of course, no one can keep this kind of thing up forever. But Miss Barmy had told Emmy that if she were a good girl, her parents would probably want to see her more often. And so Emmy kept on bravely trying. So far, it hadn't helped. Emmy's parents went on one vacation after another to Paris, to Salamanca, to the Isle of Boogaloo, and hardly ever seemed to come home or even to miss her at all. "If you did better in school, I'm sure they would be pleased," said Miss Barmy, admiring her polished fingernails. This was unjust. "My last report card was all A's," Emmy said sturdily, remembering how hard she had worked for them. "But not a single A plus, dear." Miss Barmy smiled sweetly, checking her lipstick in a pocket. "How are your ballet lessons coming? Are you getting any less clumsy?" Emma's shoulders slumped. She had tripped just last week. "Really, Emmeline, your parents might pay attention to you if you ever did everything and anything worth paying attention to. Why don't you bring home some more ribbons and trophies?" "I have a whole shelf full," Emmy said faintly. "You just have to try a little harder, dear. Fill 2 shelves." So Emmy did. Not that anyone noticed. Still, Miss Palmer said that good girls didn't care too much about being noticed, so Emmy tried not to care. She really was a little too good, which is why she liked to sit by the rat. The rat was not good at all. When the children at Grayson Lake Elementary reached in to feed him, he snapped at their fingers. When they had a little trouble with fractions, he sneered, and he often made cutting remarks in a low voice when the teacher was just out of earshot. Emmy was the only one who heard him, and even she wondered sometimes if she just was imagining things. One Wednesday in May, when not one person had seemed to notice her all morning, Emmy asked to stay indoors for recess. "I had spelling to study," she explained to Master Herbivore. The teacher hurrying out after his class didn't look at her as he nodded permission. At least Emmy thought he had nodded. "Thank you," said Emmy, and then she heard something that sounded oddly like a snort. She looked at the rat, and he snorted again. He was scowling as usual. "Why are you always so mean?" Emmy wondered aloud. She didn't expect the rat to answer. She had tried to speak to him before, and he had always pretended not to hear. But this time he curled his upper lip. "Why are you always so good?" Emmy was too startled to respond. The rat shrugged one furry shoulder. "It doesn't get you anywhere. Just look at you, missing recess to study words you could spell in your sleep. And the only thing that happens is you get ignored." Emma looked away. It was true. Her parents never answered the letters she sent, even though she copied them over for neatness and gave them to Miss Barmy to mail. Her teacher kept forgetting her name, even though she had made a placard for her desk and said, "Emmy," in big red letters edged with silver glitter. And she didn't want to tell the rat, but she didn't mind missing recess at all. For Emmy, recess was a time when she felt more alone than ever. "The bad ones get all the attention," said the rat. "Try being bad for once. You might like it." Emmy thought about being bad. It had its appeal. If she were bad, she could stick out her tongue at Miss Barmy. She could call her parents long distance whenever she wanted. She could climb on her desk in school and scream until the other kids had to notice her. "No one will like it if I'm bad," she said. No one likes it. No one likes you anyway, said the rat bluntly. Emmy frowned. They don't dislike me. That's right, the rat answered promptly. Nobody likes you. Nobody dislikes you. Nobody cares about you either way. You're big nothing if you ask me. I didn't, said Emmy with some spirit. The rat's whiskers twitched. That's the first time I've heard you sound like anything but a piece of bread. Why don't you stand up for yourself more often? Listen, Emmy said. It's not like I don't try. Yesterday when that girl with the ponytail batted in line, you let her. And when that kid who sits across from you, the soccer star, the freckled one with hair that looks like a haystack. Joe Benson. Yeah, him. Well, when the haystack hair was walking backward and stepped on your foot, you said sorry. I was just being nice, said Emmy's tongue. You're too nice, said the rat sharply. A little menace is good for the soul. I highly recommended it. Emmy lifted her chin. Being mean doesn't get you anywhere. Nobody pets you. Nobody plays with you. I get what I want, said the rat, showing his long yellow teeth. I get respect, which is more than I can say for you. Emmy glared at him. You get respect? You live in a cage. The rat looked stunned. Well, it's true, Emmy said crossly. Don't tell me you haven't noticed. You know, the bars, the lock on the door. The rat's whiskers trembled. You're not being very nice. Nice? I thought a little menace was good for the... Most people don't mention it. Most people know better than to taunt a rodent about his unfortunate situation. Look, you were the one who said. It's not my fault I'm locked up. The rat's voice quavered pathetically. I committed no crime. Have I survived kidnapping from the nest? Unjust imprisonment and absolutely appalling food. He gave his dish of pellets and contemptuous kick, only to be mocked by a little child? I'm bigger than you, Emmy began hotly, and you're the one who said I shouldn't be so nice. But not to me. It's different when you're mean to me. All right, said Emmy. There was the thunder of footsteps and the clatter of voices in the hall. Emmy watched resignedly as her classmates poured in, laughing and talking. They all seemed friendly enough to one another, but no matter how Emmy tried, they just looked right through her as though she weren't there. Why were things so different here? At her old school, she had lots of friends, but then her parents had inherited all that money and moved across town to live in great-great-uncle William's old mansion on the shores of Grayson Lake, and after that a lot of things had changed. Maybe it's me, Amy thought dismally. Maybe I've turned into some horrible person and I don't even know it. She opened the book and bent her head, letting her straight brown hair fall around her face like a curtain. But as the children around her quieted down, she heard a small sob. Emmy peeked sideways. The rat had retreated to the far corner of his cage, his face buried in his forepaws. He looked as if he were sleeping, but Emmy saw the rat's gray shoulders heave, and after a while one small paw emerged to wipe the corner of his eye. Poor rat! For all his tough talk, he was awfully sensitive. Apparently she shouldn't have mentioned his cage. Sorry, she whispered, and then the phone in the teacher's desk rang. Emma? Emma Len Addison? Mr. Herberford gazed out over the heads of his students. Emmy stood up. No, I don't see her, he said into the phone. Joe Benson snickered. Emmy walked forward and stood by the teacher's desk. What did she have to do? She wondered, bewildered. Throw firecrackers under his chair? Hang from the ceiling and make like a monkey? She tugged at the teacher's sleeve and poked loudly in his ear. Here I am, Mr. Herbivore. The teacher stared at her doubtfully. Oh, are you sure? He looked puzzled. Well, you're wanted in Dr. Lander's office. Emmy knocked grumpily at Dr. Lander's door. She hated visiting the psychologist. She already had to sit there an hour every other week, just making up stuff for him to write in his blue notebook. Why did she have to go again? The door opened and stepped back. "Hello, dear," said Miss Barmy. The nanny had soft dark hair and green eyes rimmed with gold like a cat's. Her lipstick was a sleek pink, and when she smiled, she showed a glimpse of perfectly even teeth, like a row of white chisels. Dr. Lander was gazing at her with open admiration. Men always did admire Miss Barmy. Emmy didn't know why. Maybe it was the odd cane she carried that everyone found so fascinating. Or maybe men thought she was pretty. Years ago, Emmy knew Miss Barmy had won a beauty contest. But in spite of that, Emmy thought the nanny's face looked hard, as if all the makeup were a polished pink shell that no one could crack. Now then, Emmeline, Dr. Lander has kindly offered us the use of his conference room. The psychologist opened a side door with a grand gesture. Emmy sat down stiffly. Have I done something wrong? Miss Barmy brushed a fleck from her linen cuff. Well, you did contradict me this morning about the time of your parents' arrival. Amy frowned. Her parents' plane was supposed to land tomorrow evening at 5:30. She had been sure, but Miss Barmy had insisted the correct time was an hour later. And this was so important that she had to miss class? Don't, Emmy thought fiercely, don't tell me I can't meet them at the airport. Miss Barmy smiled. Never fear, you can still drive with Gems to the airport. I know how precious are the tender bonds between parents and child. How did Miss Barmy manage to guess Emmy's thoughts so often? It was creepy. Yet, when you contradict me, clearly something is not in balance. Perhaps the vitamin cell repositories or the beta hydroxy of the brain. You could even be having an epidermal skin sensitivity. Emmy flinched. The last time Miss Palmy had identified a skin problem, she had given Emmy a special tonic to cleanse her inner system. Unfortunately, it had turned her face a vivid orange for a whole week. Another time, Miss Barmy had taken Emmy offshore for months, saying she was trying to discover if Emmy's behavior problems were allergy related. Emmy had almost cried on her 10th birthday when everyone else was given an exceptional large slice of 5-layer chocolate cake and she got a tofu bar. But the herbology inoculum is, I think, the best solution, and I trust you'll soon feel the corrective effect of the proper reflexology balance. There, Emmeline, drink it all, and you'll feel ever so much better. Emma looked with distaste at the bottle of spring peach essence to which Miss Barmy had added 3 drops from a small unlabeled vial. The liquid turned from pale pink to swirling violet and emitted a faint puff of vapor. Quickly now, before the vitamin distillate is absorbed by the ozone. Miss Amy spoke sharply, or I will keep you in your room when your parents come. Amy shut her eyes, held her nose, and gulped the liquid down. She had to see her parents first thing. They had been gone for weeks, and the ride home from the airport was always the best. Snuggled between her mom and dad in the back seat, laughing and talking, it was almost like the old days before they had moved from the apartment above their bookstore before Miss Barmy. Miss Barmy dropped the vial into her square lizard skin purse and closed the jaws with a snap. Dr. Lander stood hastily as she opened the door. Thank you ever so much, Miss Barmy, said sweetly. Emmeline forgot to take her medicine and they had to give a corrective dose. Of course, said Dr. Lander, holding on to Miss Barmy's hand longer than was strictly necessary. Please call on me any time at all. Amy trudged back to her classroom, hoping that her face hadn't turned blue or pimply, or that her hair hadn't started to fall out. Why did Miss Barmy keep giving her medicine? She was never sick, and she didn't have mental problems. So why did the nanny keep setting up appointments with the psychologist? I'm not the one who's crazy, Emmy muttered to the rats as she sat down. But the rat was still sulking and wouldn't look at her. So Emmy wrote a note, rolled it up tight, and pushed it between the bars of the rat's cage just as the bell rang. She didn't bother to make sure no one was watching her because no one ever did. Hey, Amy, whispered Joe Benson, grinning all over his freckled face. Are you sure the rat can read? And now we are in the chapter 2 of Emmy and the Incredible Shrinking Rat. Emmy stared at Joe. Someone had spoken to her. Someone actually knew her name. She said, stalling for time. How could she explain writing a note to a rodent? Joe leaned over her desk. Just watch out for his teeth, he advised, showing a bandaged finger. He beat me yesterday after school. Really? Said Emmy, still amazed to be having an actual conversation. How come? I don't know. I was just trying to feed him a carrot, and you think he would have been grateful. Huh, said the rat indignantly. Joe had swiveled slowly to face the cage on the window ledge. His mouth opened. No sound came out. How would you like it? The rat went on, folding his paws over his chest. If someone tried to mash a gigantic carrot into your mouth? Looked back at Emmy. Do you just hear? He folded, glancing uneasily at the rat. All around them, the classroom was noisy with banging desktops and shuffling feet. No one else showed any interest in the rat as he picked up Emmy's note. Joe was suddenly surrounded by his friends. Hurry up, Joe! We'll have to run laps if we're late to soccer again. What's the matter? Are you slowing down? Emmy gathered her books unnoticed by all except Joe, who stared at her wildly. She grinned at him through the jostling heads and shoulders and then swept into the stream of children and poured from the classroom, through the hall, and out the big double doors that led to the playground. The sun was bright and warm, and Emmy still had a little time before her ballet class. She slipped quickly between a hedge of bushes and the rough brick of the schoolhouse wall and squatted there to catch her breath. The big lilacs screened her from everyone in the schoolyard. It was a perfect spot to hide or just to sit and think. Emmy had sat there sometimes during recess, making little faces in the leaves with her fingernail. It was sort of stupid, but it was better than trying to join a game and getting ignored or talking to people who walked right past her. But Joe had talked to her today, and he had heard the rat too. Why was that? Emmy wondered, crawling along the narrow space between the brick wall and the bushes. 1, 2, 3, she counted windows as she passed. There was Mr. Aberforth's desk. 4, 5. She lifted her head cautiously and looked through the window directly into the rat's cage. He had picked up her note and spread it against the wall of his cage, bracing it with his paws. And even though the bottom corner kept curling up, Emmy could read the note from where she crouched. It said, I'm sorry I was mean. It didn't feel as good as you said it would, Emmy. P.S. Is respect all you want? The rat's mouth moved silently as he read the words. He was so close that Emmy could see a small patch of white fur just behind his left ear. She cleared her throat. The rat whirled around, glared, and instantly turned his back. Leaves tickled Emma's neck, and the sun warmed her hands where they pressed against the window sill. It's damp, she said at last. To pretend I'm not here. The rat tapped one foot lightly, saying nothing. It's not only damp, it's mean. The rat made an indistinct noise that sounded like "Ha!" "It's the meanest thing in the world," said Emmy severely. "To ignore someone, it makes a person feel like she doesn't even exist." The rat lifted his nose. "I'll tell you what's mean," he said to the air. "It's when certain people don't impress rodents about their substandard housing. And, and it's even worse he went on, his voice rising. "When I had to watch that," he pointed over Emmy's right shoulder. Emmy peered around the lilac bush. There was nothing much to see. Joe and his friends were on the soccer field, kicking a ball around. Beyond through the trees, Amy could see the storefronts of Main Street and the little studio where she took ballet every Wednesday afternoon. Farther down the hill to the left, she could just see the third story of her house and its red-tiled roof and her bedroom window, and after that was nothing but lake and sky. She looked back through the window at the rat. "Watch? What?" she asked curiously. The rat waved his paw irritably at the soccer fields. A distant ball rose in a perfect arc, white and black against the greening trees, and the faint sound of cheering drifted across the grass. "I could do that," the rat muttered. "What? Kick a goal? Be a star?" The rat gripped the bars of his cage. "I've practiced in my cage. Other rodents, they play out there in the moonlight. They try, but the rat drew himself up to his full height. I'd show them how it's done. They'd be astonished. They'd elect me captain." "Rodents play soccer?" Emmy asked, incredulous. The rat scowled. "Of course they play soccer," he snapped. "What do you think they do for fun? Run about frightening elephants? Scavenge in churches for crumbs? Really, your ignorance is appalling. Modern rodents have many and varied interests." "I didn't know," Amy stammered. "I'm sure, and don't apologize. You do all the time." Amy frowned. The rat sighed. "Shouldn't you be getting home? Won't your parents be worried?" "They're out of town." Amy shrugged. "Anyway, Wednesday I have ballet after school, and then French, so nobody's expecting me yet." She stared out past the trees and toward the lake and pointed. "There's my house." The rat squinted. "What? That castle-looking thing?" "It does look a little like a castle," Amy admitted. "My bedroom's in that top turret, with a blue window." The rat looked at her thoughtfully. "It's a lot bigger than the other houses." "33 rooms," said Amy gloomily. "9 bathrooms, and a housekeeper, a gardener, and a chauffeur. Oh, and Miss Parmy, my nanny." "What?" the rat said again. "No parents?" "I told you they're out of town. They've been gone for weeks and 3 days, but they're coming back tomorrow night." She looked at her watch, squinting in the bright sun. "I really should get going." But the rat's attention was back on the soccer field, where Joe had just scored another goal. The rat leaned forward until his nose was poking through the bars of his cage, his whole body tense with yearning. Emmy, watching, felt something come over her. It was a feeling unusual for her, that she very much wanted to do something she wasn't supposed to do. Her hand drifted up through the open window. Her fingers found the latch of the cage. She hesitated. If anyone saw her, Miss Barmy might find out. If Miss Barmy found out, she would give Emmy's parents a bad report, and then they might not come home at all. There was a stifled moan from the rat. His gaze was riveted to the latch, and his whole body was trembling. Then, as Emmy watched, he clasped his paws together in front of his chest, looked beseechingly into her eyes, and dropped to his knees with a little thump. Emmy wavered for a heartbeat and lifted the latch. The rat knelt perfectly still for one incredulous moment, and then he leaped to his feet. "I'm free! I'm free!" he shrieked, hopping up and down. He scrambled to the window sill and launched himself into the air, landing with a puff of dust. In an instant he was running, scampering, rolling through the wide grassy schoolyard like a small gray juggernaut. "Free!" came at last high, then cry faint in the open air, and then he was gone. Emmy walked across the schoolyard, her shoes scuffing at the grass.
The thought occurred to her that Miss Pommy would want her to pick up her feet. She didn't do it. Of course, she hadn't expected the rat to say thank you. He had never been a polite sort of rodent. But for him to leave so suddenly without even a goodbye gave Emmy a hollow feeling. The rat had been someone to talk to, even if he was rude. Now all she had to look forward to was the same old class with the same old kids who never seemed to know she was alive.
Well, no, that wasn't quite true anymore. Emmy passed the soccer field and brightened as she saw Joe, who was standing with his father. She walked slowly past them, listening in spite of herself. And I've told you before, son, if they try a wall pass, you have to follow the player, not the ball. Now don't let them fool you again. Emmy wondered for a moment what if it would be like to have the kind of father who would come to her activities, put his hand on her shoulder, and give her friendly advice. But Joe wasn't listening. He seemed to be gazing off in the distance. Had the rat run that way? Emmy walked on toward the trees that bordered the playfield and stopped. A small gray animal bounded through the grass and leaped to a tree trunk. It balanced itself with its long, bushy tail. Emmy sighed. It was only a squirrel. Another came right after the first, darting through the underbrush and to the base of the tree, its claws out and digging into the bark. Its long pink tail, Emmy sharpened to attention as the rat scrabbled up the tree. He climbed fairly well, especially considering how long he had lived in a cage with only a wire wheel that went around and round. The rat caught up to the squirrel at the first fork in the trunk and began to speak, waving a paw in the air as if to emphasize a point. Emmy couldn't make out his words, but as far as she could tell, the rat seemed to be introducing himself. The squirrel's mouth dropped open. The rat talked a little louder. Emmy caught a few words now. Pellets and the piling, and lunch. The squirrel looked distinctly dim-witted. The rat gave an irritated snort, and then, with a sudden flurry, the squirrel leaped past the rat, flew up through branches, and disappeared into a nut hole. The rat's mouth fell open in ludicrous imitation of the squirrel. Emma stifled a laugh. The rat's jaw snapped shut, and just what, may I ask, is so funny? Oh, nothing. Emmy tried for a serious tone. Are you enjoying your freedom? The rat gave a loud and disapproving sniff. I might enjoy it more if certain people weren't here. He looked sternly at Emmy. Some rodents are shy of humans. Understandably, I might add, given your long and bloody history. Long and bloody? Even your nursery rhymes need I remind you of three blind mice? Hardly fit for children, I must say. But that's just a... The rat interrupted coldly. It's too bad I can't have a little chat with a friend without you showing up to scare him off. Me? Emmy was annoyed. It was you. I beg your pardon. The sarcasm was very apparent, and I shall resume the conversation which was so rudely interrupted. Kindly do not interfere. Emmy was speechless. She watched as the rat climbed majestically up the trunk, pausing now and then to shake a hind foot as if to ward off a crumb. He arrived at the entrance to the squirrel's home, adjusted his neck fur, and knocked. There was a sudden wild flurry of gray fur at the knot hole. One paw swiped out, claws extended. The rat backed down. I he called, sounding aggrieved. You could hurt someone like that. The squirrel's head poked out of the hole. His furry arm held the stem of a very large acorn. I don't really care for nuts, thank you, the rat began, and then, with one swift movement, the acorn was flung with startling accuracy at the rat's head. It landed with a crack. The rat gave out and tumbled down, somersaulting, his little pink feet flailing helplessly in the air. And then Emmy caught him. He lay cradled between her palms, limp and gasping for breath. His small plump body was surprisingly soft in her hands. She could see the patch of white fur behind his left ear, such an even triangular shape, and a thin trail of moisture from his quivering nose. Suddenly she felt full of pity for this small, arrogant, impossible creature, and she stroked the back of his head gently with her thumb. The rat opened his eyes. "Kindly do not pet me. My name is not Fido, nor is it Fluffy. Put me down at once." "Emmy," set the rat down gently in the grass. He struggled to sit up, looking very stiff. "You have been of some service to me," he said frostily. "But let's get one thing straight. I have my own life to live, and I don't want you to following me. Your mere presence drove that poor squirrel mad, and the rat sniffed, he was just about to invite me to lunch." Emmy looked at him. "You honestly think that squirrel?" The rat waved an airy paw. "I accept your apology. Now leave me alone." "I'm not apologizing, you nutcase." "Go away! Leave me alone! Get a life!" Emmy stared at the imperious rat and turned on her heel. "Fine," she said bitterly. "I'm going." She crossed Street without looking for cars. She heard the scratch of brakes behind her as she reached the art gallery, went past the with its alley with its overflowing trash cans, and up the worn wooden steps and that led to the ballet studio. She paused on the landing, catching her breath. That ungrateful rat. Now she knew why rats had such a bad reputation. She glared through the half-open door to the dance studio. The smell of stale socks assailed her nose as a dozen sweet little girls in leotards left awkwardly. And suddenly Emmy couldn't stand the thought of pulling on a leotard and sweating with them. She gazed crossly into the alley below. She wouldn't go to dance class. She wouldn't go. What was the use of trying to do everything she was supposed to when nobody ever cared anyway? Emmy was flooded with a fierce excitement. She pelted down the sagging stairs and skidded onto the sidewalk. She looked up and down the street at all the shops she had visited with Miss Barmy, and then she caught sight of the alley again. It stretched out before her, dark and messy, forbidding. She hesitated. It looked dirty. It looked dangerous. She stepped in. Chapter 3. Emma looked quickly down the narrow alley, her footsteps echoing off the walls that rose on either side of her like a canyon of sooty brick. A smell of overripe fruit and spoiled meat curled up from the brimming trash cans. But then there was light again, and a central triangle of patchy grass like a little park, and a wonderful maze of back streets that she had never seen before, crumped with shops. Amy gazed around, delighted. Miss Barmy had only taken her to stores where mannequins wore expensive suits and jewelry spoke in quiet voices over glass countertops. These shops were, well, shabbier, but they looked a lot more interesting. She wandered by a candy store, its window filled with colorful jars, peppermints, gumdrops, chocolate nibbles, all packed full of sugar and not a tofu bar in sight. A smiling woman was handing out caramels at the door. They were unwrapped. They probably weren't at all sanitary. Emmy took three and popped them in her mouth all at once. An exuberant puppy, small, white, and yappy, bounced out of a side street and went straight for Emmy's ankles, drilling. Emmy got another caramel from the lady and dropped it in the dog's mouth. There was a tattoo parlor with foreign-looking letters on its sign, and a big, hairy man getting tattooed right in the window. Emmy watched in fascination as the needle was poked into his back. She wasn't exactly sure what was being tattooed, but she was fairly certain Miss Barney wouldn't have approved. There was a small grocery that smelled of fish and a bakery that smelled of vanilla and almonds. A narrow building next door carried the sign, "Home for Troubled Girls." and Emmy giggled, feeling unaccountably wild and silly. "Trouble, that's me," she said gaily to the puppy, dancing a few steps to the flamenco music blaring from the shop across the street. No wonder Miss Barmy never came here. No expensive clothes to buy, no fashionable people to impress, and no health food stores anywhere. There was a shoe store, though. Emma looked at it doubtfully. Miss Barmy always had metal tips put on her shoes. Emma thought that maybe she just liked to hear herself walk. There was a white-haired man outside the shoe shop door who was sitting on a low stool, whittling a block of wood. He was soft-looking, rather like a dumpling dressed in old clothes, and his face was wrinkled. Emmy edged closer, a long, curly shaving peeled off his knife. "Want to see Missy?" he asked, as the puppy pounced on the wood shaving. "Mr. B don't mind none." The old man ran a hand through what was left of his hair and looked up at Emmy with a gentle expression. "Who's Mr. B? Is he your boss?" Emmy reached out a finger touching the small pointed face of the little carving. Was it an otter, or maybe a crash? A flower pot thrown from above broke on the sidewalk. "Mr. B, are you working, or are you jabbering?" The screech came from an upstairs window. Emma looked up, startled. There was nothing to be seen but a scrawly hand pulling back the lace curtains and shaking a finger. "Working, dear?" called the chubby old man, instantly picking up his knife again. "Working hard as always, my little rosebud." There was a vigorous snort. "Then see that you keep at it. You old fool!" Another flower pot flew past, just missing Emma's foot. The man leaned closer to Amy. "I'm Mr. B," he whispered, "and up there, that's my boss, Mrs. B. Here, step under the awning so she don't hit you." He glanced up at the window, chuckling. "She's a beautiful one, my Addie, but she's always had a bit of a temper." "Beautiful!" Amy craned her neck, but the scrawny hand, yellow as a chicken leg, was all she could see. "Mr. B!" Amy dodged a violently thrown cup and saucer and fled toward the corner, where there stood a stately house of faded blue. She ducked behind a sign that read a Peebles, attorney at law, and looked back at Mr. B. He was sweeping at the broken pieces as calmly as if he did it every day. Relieved to be out of range, Emmy cut across the tip of the green to what looked like a pet shop on the next corner. A painted sign swung from the doorway. Emmy ran closer to see, and the puppy followed barking happily. On the sign was painted a familiar gray form, and beneath it, tall, spidery letters spelled out, "The Antique Rat." The storefront was old-fashioned looking, with vine-covered brick and broad window sills. Amy pressed her nose to the smudged and dusty glass. She could make out carved tables and chairs. She slumped, disappointed. It was just an ordinary antique store, the kind that the housekeeper, Mrs. Bricksniff, had dragged her into more than once when Miss Barmy had her day off. There were no cages, or rats, or any pets at all. Emma looked down at her feet, where the excitable puppy was licking her shoes. Maybe her parents would allow her to keep the puppy if she asked them. Sometimes when they came home from a trip, they were very loving for a while. Emmy was scratching the puppy behind the ears, considering this, when a familiar rhythm stopped her cold. It was the sound of footsteps, firm footsteps, rapid, purposeful footsteps, made by shoes with metal tips, and every so often another thunking sound out of rhythm. The puppy whimpered, and Emmy drifted like smoke teeth into the shadowed entryway. Only one person in the world sounded like that when she walked. Fighting an inner dread, Emmy quietly turned the brass doorknob of the antique rat. A bell tinkled faintly in the back room, and a fine dusting of cream sifted down from top of the frame. Emmy eased the door shut and stood behind it. She could see a bit of the street from this angle, and a bell tinkled faintly in the back room, and a fine dusting of grime sifted down from the top of the frame. Emmy eased the door shut and stood behind it. She could see a bit of the street from this angle, and her breath quickened as a woman's legs came into view, along with a swinging cane. Lizard skin shoes stopped abruptly, pointing at the storefront, and the cane came to rest. Miss Barmy was looking in the window. Emmy flattened herself against the door. She didn't need to look at the cane to see it. Made of hardwood, polished almost white, it was intricately carved with miniature faces, their hair intertwined. Miss Palmer said they were the faces of people she had taken care of. She'd promised that someday she would have Emmy's face carved on one of the blank patches. Emmy, surprised, Emmy suppressed a shudder. Every grown-up who ever saw the cane told Emmy she was a lucky girl to have such a remarkable nanny. But something about the little faces bothered her. The footsteps started up again. Emmy could hear them passing the window, scraping on the step, and stopping at the door. She slid sideways, silent as a cat, and crouched behind a large and dusty dresser, just as the doorknob turned. "Yes," said a voice, a teenage boy. Emmy guessed. She pressed her face against the side of the dresser, breathing softly. It wasn't that she was afraid of Miss Barmy, not exactly, she told herself. It would just be so much easier if she didn't have to explain skipping ballet. All was quiet. Amy could almost feel Miss Barmy's eyes looking the person up and down. "May I help you?" The boy's voice was patient. "Who are you? Where's Mr. Vole?" Miss Barmy's usually sulky voice sounded abrupt. "My uncle is out just now. Is there something I can do for you?" The cane tapped on the floorboards. "I can't wait. I'll leave a message." "Yes." "Tell your uncle, did you say, that I want the usual," Miss Barmy said sharply. "Tomorrow evening, 10 minutes to 6 on the dot." The usual? He'll know what I mean, and I want it delivered quietly. You understand? Came the back door and knocked twice. "I'll be waiting." There was a soft sound of scratching like a pencil on paper. "And the name?" "Hell, know who I am," Miss Barmy said coldly. "I'm the one who doesn't pay." "Doesn't pay?" the boy stammered. "I don't think my uncle will allow. I mean, his rates are very expensive." "They're exorbitant, young man. They're highway robbery. Fortunately, Mr. Vole and I have an agreement. Oh, he'll be very glad to let me have a usual for no fee at all, you'll see." "Yes, ma'am. And where should it be delivered?" "The old Addison mansion in Grayson Lake. It's the last house on Loons Bay Road. Don't forget 5:50 tomorrow. Back door, double knock." "Yes, ma'am." There was a gritty sound of shoes turning off steps, of the door creaking open. Annie held her breath. "Tell your uncle to see to it personally," Miss Barmy said, "or I shall be seriously disturbed." Amy poked her head out as the footsteps died away. The boy was tall and slightly pudgy, with stooped shoulders and a pale complexion. His ears stuck out from hair that needed a trim, but he looked at her kindly. Amy felt awkward. Should she apologize for listening in and hearing Miss Barmy order? What had she ordered, anyway? She glanced out the window in time to see Miss Barmy's disappear into the shoe shop across the street. Amy shut her eyes. She had had a narrow escape. Feeling kind of shaky, the boy's hand on her elbow was warm. "Here, sit down. It's the rats, you know." "The the rats?" Amy sat. obediently on a green velvet chair embroidered with small white creatures. They'll make some people crazy. The boy waved his hand at the cluttered interior of the shop. My uncle's get rats on the brain. Emmy followed the boy's gaze. The shop was packed with furniture of all kinds, small round tables, straight back chairs, great gilded mirrors, and on every piece there was painted or carved or embroidered some kind of rodent for decoration. Do people actually? Amy paused, feeling that the question she wanted to ask was not quite polite. Buy the stuff? The boy signed and shifted his broom. Not much, but sometimes people come for the real ones. Your uncle sells rats? Amy was stuck by a thought. Does he catch them himself? She waited for the answer, thinking hurriedly of Rat. Her rat. He was rude and ungrateful, but he was still her friend. Amy didn't think she could bear to see him caged again. The boy shrugged. I don't know, he admitted. But my uncle doesn't collect ordinary rats, and the people who come here don't want ordinary rats. He laughed, tucking a notebook and pencil into his back pocket. I wouldn't even say that. The people who come here are ordinary people. A little weird, most of them. Emmy nodded. Miss Barney was weird enough. What had she been doing in a rat shop? And what was it? She wanted delivered to Emmy's house tomorrow evening at 10 minutes to 6. Amy passed a hand over her forehead. Ballet probably wasn't over yet. If she ran, she could make some excuse about why she was late. If you turned around and walked out right now, she could be through the dark alley and back on her safe and ordinary world in 2 minutes flat. The boy peered at her. You still look kind of squeamish. Rats are okay once you get to know them. Better than people sometimes. His smile became a bit uncertain. Want something to drink? Amy nodded. The boy led the way to an alcove in the rear of the store with a lumpy maroon couch. Have a seat, I'll be right back. He opened the door behind the couch and climbed up a seat of long, narrow stairs. There were books stacked on the couch with titles like My Life Among the Rats, a memoir, and Scientific Odontology 101. Emmy was paging through one called Lemmings or Leaders when she heard a rustling sort of noise. Instinctively, she pulled up her feet and looked under the couch. There it was again. Something had rustled. Behind the doorway hung with a red velvet curtain. The boy tramped down the stairs. Here. He held out a glass of something fizzy. My name's Brian. What's yours? Emmy. She took a sip and smiled at Brian, who was the homeliest teenager she had ever seen, but also in an odd way the nicest looking. He smiled back. Do you want to see the rats? You won't be able to buy any. Nobody buys them. They only rent them anyway. You rent rats? Uncle say they're so rare, nobody can afford them. But it doesn't cost anything to look. Amy thought Brian might be surprised at what she could afford, but she followed him through the doorway hung with red velvet. A slight animal odor made her nose wrinkle, and she stepped inside with the feeling that she was entering another world. The faint noises from the street were suddenly muffled as the heavy velvet dropped behind her, and in the silence she could hear a rustling as every animal in the cages, or so it seemed, turned to face her. She held back, aghast, and a large rodent with bright orange teeth lifted its head. Don't worry, that's just the beaver. Brian patted the top of the cage. She's big, but she's gentle, aren't you, girl? A bell tinkled lightly. I'll be right back, Brian said, brushing through the velvet curtain. Was a beaver a rat? Perhaps a sort of cousin. The beaver gazed at her through tired-looking eyes. Poor thing, said Amy, moving on. Cage after cage held some kind of rodent, from the giant rat of Sumatra to the tiniest vole, each with its own label, and most seemed irritable, or worse. Emmy was beginning to wonder if the rat had been a particularly good-tempered specimen. After all, when she caught sight of a very small mouse with big ears and huge dark eyes, it looked appallingly at her and touched one small paw to the bars of its cage. Emmy squatted on her heels, peering in. What a tiny little thing, and so pretty! Its fawn-colored fur looked as soft and light as dandelion fuzz.
Longing to hold it in her hand, Emmy ignored all the warnings Miss Barmy had ever given against touching strange animals, and put one finger between the bars. The little mouse curled its tail up tight. It looked at Emmy, its enormous brown eyes so thoughtful, and then it reached out a paw and patted Emmy's finger exactly 3 times in quick succession. It clasped its paws immediately behind its back, as if waiting for her to make the next move, and Emmy sucked in her breath. It was too much to believe that she should find another rodent as exceptional as the rat. "But can you speak?" she whispered. The mouse looked at her attentively but said nothing. Emmy lifted the tag that was attached to the cage. "Enter, mouse," she read aloud. Emmy had heard of deer mice before, but never an indoor mouse. "Must be a misprint," she decided, turning the tag over, and there on the other side, in very small type, she read, "Ender mouse makes the absent heart grow fonder. As use as directed, satisfaction guaranteed." "Makes the absent heart grow fonder," Emmy whispered. "Do you really?" The tiny mouse looked at her for a long moment. Then it placed its two front paws over its chest and bowed very low. "Do you?" Emmy paused, swallowing painfully. "I mean, can you do it for two absent hearts grown up once?" The mouse looked searchingly at Emmy with its dark, beautiful eyes, and then it smiled ever so slowly and gently. It nodded twice. Desire flooded Emmy's heart and brain. If only could she somehow buy this mouse. How much was it? For the first time ever, she felt glad to be rich. She had a room full of expensive toys, and she hardly used. Could she sell those? Emmy whirled to her feet, unable to sit still, and began to pace. She looked at the other cages. What other wonderful things could these rats do? She turned over tag after tag, reading "Infusion of courage," guaranteed to sniff out a lie. To induce coming sleep, makes the fat become thin, triples maturity, grows thick hair fast. Emma's eyes wandered from cage to cage. No wonder these rodents were expensive. People would pay almost anything to have some of these things, and they were more than she hadn't even read yet. Amy reached for the next tag and stopped with her hand in midair. The animal slapped in the cage was an ordinary gray rat, the size of a squirrel, but on the back of its head, visible just behind the ear was a triangular patch of white fur. Chapter 4. "Rat!" gasped Emmy. The rodent ignored her. "Listen!" Emmy gripped the cage, frantic to get the animal's attention. "I'll get you out, no matter what it costs." There was a sound of footsteps behind her, and the swish of the velvet curtain. "Brian!" cried Emmy without turning around. "How much is this rat?" "More than you have in your piggy bank," rasped an unfamiliar voice. "Get your fingers away from the cage. If you're bitten, you'll be sorry." Amy turned her head. Brian was hovering apologetically in the background. In front of him stood what she could only be the uncle. Shorter than his nephew, he looked like someone who had shrunk while his clothes hadn't. His trousers were loose and belted high, his shirt was at least 2 sizes too big, and he exuded the musty smell of a closet that hadn't been aired for years. "Amy, this is my uncle, Professor Vole." "A professor?" thought Amy, incredulous. "A professor of what? Rats?" "Nice to meet you," she said, lifting her chin. "But I don't use piggy banks. I prefer blue chip stocks." Not for nothing had she lessened in on conversations about her parents' investments. "Well," Professor Vole placed his fingertips together, "in any case, that particular rat is not for sale. Look at the tag, little girl." Emma lifted the tag, irritated. She was almost 11, hardly a little girl anymore. "Shrinking rat of Schenectady," she read aloud and turned it over, "sold in pairs only." Amy frowned. The rat was still hunched over and moving. What had this rat man, done to him? Just a short time ago he had been as sassy and full of himself as always, and now. "That's my rat," she said firmly. "You must have just caught him.
I saw him somewhere else only an hour ago. Professor Vole blinked. You saw another rat? You say? No, this one. I'd know him anywhere. The man tapped his fingertips together one after the other, looking thoughtful. Brian, he said, how long have you cared for this particular rat? Ever since you brought me here to work. Almost a whole month. Brian smiled his kind smile. So it can't be yours after all, Amy. Amy looked at Brian. His face was transparently honest. It was impossible to imagine him telling a lie. Maybe, she posed. Could it be another rat that looks like him? Yes. Professor Vole's fingers interlocked. And where exactly did you see these other rats? His voice was carefully casual, but behind his gold-rimmed spectacles his eyes glinted. Oh, around, said Amy uneasily. But, but what, my dear? Professor Vole reached out a bony hand as the thin lips stretched in an attempt at a smile. Get our guest another soda. Brian backed out, looking worried. But how can there be two rats with the exact same patch of white hair behind the ear? Hey, that hurts! The bony fingers clutched her arm. The rat man bent until his face was almost touching hers. Emmy could see the dark pores on the end of his beaky nose and short hairs like bristles poking out from his nostrils. What did you say? His voice was fierce. I said that hurts. Emmy tried to pull her arm away, but his grasp was unrelenting. No, before that. What were you saying about two rats? The man squeezed a little harder. I said it was odd to have two rats the same, and the white patch behind the ear. Yes, Emmy gasped, just the same. What was the shape? He demanded, his breath smelling like stale crackers. A circle? A square? No, a triangle. Please let me go. I haven't done anything. With a grip like iron, the professor turned Emmy to face the cage. There, he said, his voice reedy with excitement. Think, was your rat's white patch behind the right ear like this one or the left? Emma looked trembling. The white patch was certainly behind the right ear, on the rat in the cage. But how could this awful man expect her to remember which ear it was behind on her rat? And how in the world was she supposed to think when she was terrified? But any idea she had about asking him these questions was quickly rejected at the sight of his face. Watery blue eyes were popping with red veins, the sinews on his neck stood out like waxed rope, and altogether he had such a look of deranged lunacy that Emmy shut her eyes. Think. When had she last noticed the rat's white patch? He had been up in the tree. The squirrel had thrown a nut, had fallen down into her hands. Emmy concentrated. She had held the rat, she had stroked the white patch, she remembered how the fire disappeared under her thumb and then sprang back into place. She opened her eyes. It was the left ear. She laughed in relief. You were right. This one isn't my rat. I'm so sorry. The rat man's stained teeth showed in an elated grin, and he clapped his hands together. Completely mental, Amy thought. Backing up, she lifted the velvet curtain. Where is this rat? The professor moved to block her way. I'll pay any price you ask. He's not mine, Amy stomped. He's the classroom Pete. What? Class? What school? The man's voice shook. Has he beaten anyone? Is he locked up? Amy couldn't admit that she'd let the rat go. This demented man was capable of anything. He was still in his cage when I left class today, she said truthfully, sliding her feet another few inches. She ducked behind the curtain. Here you go, Emmy. Want a root beer? Brian looked down at her with a grin. He had positioned himself squarely in front of his uncle. She took her chance, running like a rabbit. She dashed for the door behind her. She heard a crash and some violent swearing, but by then she was out and flitting down the street as if the giant rat of Sumatra were after her. She leaped over the garbage in the alleyway and burst out onto the main street sidewalk painting. What time was it? How long had she been in the rat shop? The sky had turned cloudy and it looked as if a storm were brewing. Ballet must be over by now, but maybe there was still time to sneak into French. into French class and then walk out to meet Miss Barmy on the sidewalk. On the sidewalk, there half a block away, was a woman in a bulky raincoat silhouetted against the gray sky. She was at the entrance to Emmy's French class and she was tapping her foot. Emmy longed to hide. If only she were a rat, she could crawl into the little crumbling hole on the side of those steps by the concrete planter. It looked a perfect size. I don't think she went this way, Uncle. Brian's voice echoed in the alley behind her. Emmy flew across the road, ducked behind a bush, and peered through the leaves, shivering a little as a sudden cold gust swirled about her. Brian's uncle poked his pinched face out of the alley, snorted in frustration, and turned back. Good. Now all Emmy had to do was come up with an excuse for not being in French class. With any luck, Miss Barmy would only make her shampoo with oil of yak, or write a paper on better bowel habits through diary empowerment, or read an article on the many exciting uses of tree balm. There was a rustle of feet behind her. Emmy whipped around to face a pair of grass-stained soccer shorts. Hey! Joe Benson squatted on his heels. Listen about that rat. Emmy glanced over her shoulder. The woman in the coat was looking at her watch. What's going on? Joe looked embarrassed but determined. Don't pretend you didn't hear. The rat talked, because I know you did. I'm not pretending, said Amy hurriedly. He does. He talks. I don't know why, either, but nobody else ever seems to hear him. I did, said Joe. Yeah, well, you heard him today, but I've been hearing him all year. Amy glanced nervously at the sky. It was going to rain any minute now. If she got wet, Miss Barney would make her up in about 50 blankets and sweat for an hour to ward off a cold. All year? You haven't been our class all year. Amy stared at him. I've been sitting across from you since September, she said slowly. No way. Amy nodded. I have. I was there on the first day of class. Don't you remember? The rat bit me and I yelled, I said. I was there when Mr. Herbivore tripped over the pumpkin in October, and when Roby brought a snake to school the last day before Christmas break and it got lost, and in February when Tantra only got two valentines and she cried, and I saw you break your shoelace just last week and run around the day in your socks, and okay, okay, Joe ran a hand through his already messy hair. But how come I can't remember you? Emmeline Augusta, I see you behind the bush. Emmy whirled around. Steaming across the road was a broad, brisk woman with a mole on the end of her chin. Emmy almost melted with relief. It wasn't Miss Barmy after all. Emmeline Augusta, Joe said in an undertone. Emmy stood up. I was named after two great aunts, she muttered. Don't rub in it. Why? Hello, Mrs. Bricksniff. Emmy put on her most winning smile. Don't you, Mrs. Bricksniff, me? Here it's Miss Barmy's afternoon off and I don't even know the proper time to come and get you, and now I see you dilly-daddling across the street without so much as a by your leave. Joe coughed to hide what might have been a snicker. Dilly-dallying, he murmured as Mrs. Bricksniff sneered. Amy ignored him. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Bricksniff. It's my fault, ma'am. Joe stepped forward. Amy and I are friends. Emma looked at him in surprise. And I had a question about the school project we're working on, Joe went on, shaking the housekeeper's plump hand in a businesslike manner. Joe, Tallman beckoned from his car. You need some more practice before supper. Joe grabbed his hair with both hands, looking exasperated. We've got to figure this out, he said. How about tomorrow after school? Emmeline is usually busy after school, said Miss Bricksniff. What's your project about? Emmy looked blankly at Joe. Rats, said Joe promptly. See you tomorrow, Emmy. Emmy followed the housekeeper who had stride like a triathlete. If only she could meet Joe after school tomorrow, but of course she was busy. More than once, she had enviously watched the children who poured out of the school building at 3 o'clock into the free air with nothing to do but play. Mrs. Bricksniff, Emmy trotted alongside, slightly breathless. Do you suppose my parents would mind if I didn't do so much after school? Mrs. Bricksniff turned, startled. Your parents paid good money for those classes. Money isn't a thing to be wasted, even if you are rich. Yes, but Emmy tried again. After a whole day of school, it gets so tiring. Do you think I could just quit ballet and French? Certainly not. Well then, how about gymnastics? That's on Thursday, out of the question. Pottery and tap dancing, well, theater, tennis, basket weaving. Now, see here, young lady. Mrs. Bricksnip looked down over her double chins. Miss Barmy signed you up for all those things, and you know as well as I do what that means. Amy sighed. She knew. I don't care if she's my cousin. She's a nasty customer when crossed. It's a hard enough job that I have to do. What with 9 bathrooms to clean, not to mention all those windows and your parents flying in unexpectedly and having all those parties. Amy looked at Miss Barney and Mrs. Bricksnip were cousins. So don't complain to me, and I wouldn't complain to Miss Barney either, or she might just sign you up for something else in the evening too. I have to have some time to do homework, Amy said sadly. And would that matter to her? It would not, said Mrs. Bricksmith, puffing out her neck until she looked like a stuffed frog. Now hurry up, it's starting to rain. Well, a couple of drowned rats before we get out of this. The housekeeper turned determinedly down the hill, unfurling a large black umbrella as a peal of thunder crashed. She centered the umbrella directly over her rather ponderous bulk so that Emmy had to stay very close in bed to be even partly protected as the rain poured off the umbrella in a drip line that soaked her left shoulder. Amy was naturally cold and miserable and wet to spare kind of felt for the rat, who would be nearly drowned out in this rain, and hoped that he had finally found a squirrel who would let him in. It was dark in Annie's bedroom, but the storm had blown itself out at last, and as she watched from her window in the topmost turret, a final ranked cloud scudded across the bright face of the moon and vanished. There was a brisk knock at Annie's bedroom. Miss Bricknell says to have a hot bath before bed, said a young woman bringing in fresh towels. I'll run it for you, honey. Thanks, Maggie, said Amy, thinking how much she liked the new housemaid who always had smiles, but I can do it myself. Maggie bent over the large jacuzzi set in blue Italian tiles and turned on the faucets. Honey, if I didn't do it for people, I'd be out of job. She smiled her wide, friendly smile, crooked teeth and big nose and all, and Amy smiled right back. Now I'll just lay out her pajamas and my stars. Maggie had been rummaging in Emmy's pajama drawer, stopped with her head half turned. She was looking into the playroom. Amy felt her cheeks get hot. She hadn't asked for the toys, but they just kept coming. Her parents sent them from London and New York and every other place they went where she wasn't. There was a dollhouse with beds and wallpaper and chest full of doll clothes. There was an expensive model train set with a track that went through tunnels and mountains and all around the room, and a play kitchen, and an art center with a little sink for washing up, and an electronic keyboard and a proper theater and every Lego set and stuffed animal imaginable. Amy looked at Maggie embarrassed. Can we go to bed now? Maggie turned swiftly. Of course, sugar. Just pop yourself in the tub and then tuck yourself in. Don't forget to say your prayers and I'll see you at breakfast. Do you like sausages? Amy looked at her doubtfully. The tofu kind? She had experience with those. Over my dead body, Maggie said cheerfully. Amy threw on her pajamas and bounced into bed, turning the picture on her bedside table so it caught the moonlight. Her parents looked back at her. Jim Addison was big and broad-shouldered, with eyes that twinkled at the corners. His arm was thrown over his wife's shoulders, and Kathy Addison's soft brown hair blew back against his sweaters. She was smiling right into the camera, her eyes warm. They looked like that coming off the plane. Her father would grin and ruffle her hair, and her mother would swoop down and hug her close. Then, when they got home, her parents might play a board game with her, or sit by the fire and tell stories or want to look at her school papers. And they would say they were proud of her and that she was a good girl and that they loved her very much. Amy shut her eyes happily, snuggling deep under her blanket, but sleep wouldn't come. What was so important about the white fur behind the rat's ear? And did the rats in the store really have amazing powers? There There had certainly been something very unusual about the amber mask. Amy idly watched leaf shadows move and dance on the wall above her bed. How odd there had been a rat in the store that looked so much like her own rat. And then there was that awful rat man. She hadn't told him her last name, but might he find her anyway? Amy shuddered and quickly thought of something more pleasant. Joe. Now there was a nice surprise. Someone had noticed her. She gazed at the fluttering leaf shadows. It was good to have a friend. In fact, she had made three friends today, if you counted Brian and the rat. The leaves moved. They had been moving all along, of course, but this movement was different. It was not the gentle fluttering of paper-thin shapes in a light breeze. It was a stealthy, purposely movement of something. Something lumpy, something that reached out one stubby finger and tapped. Emmy stiffened. The finger reached out again and tapped on the glass. Emmy looked closer. It wasn't a finger after all. It was a shabby, shorty, furry foreleg with a paw attached. It was the rat!